Everyone, I'd like to introduce, we'll give everybody a chance. We will start with Commissioner Reed.
Let's wait until, let's get the meeting in order because we have. Welcome to the City of Helena City Manager Commission interview. Right now, we're interviewing Clifford Strachan. February 21st, 2023 at 4 p.m. This meeting is called to order. Madam Clerk.
City Commissioner Dean.
Here.
City Commissioner Logan.
Here.
Commissioner Reed.
Here.
Commissioner Shirtliff.
Here.
Mayor Collins.
Here.
And Representative from CMS, Jim Cairns.
Here.
Okay. Clifford, we're about to, the first thing we're doing is asking you, what are the names before you're here?
No, I am so glad you have them listed. Otherwise, I'm gonna be switching into this. A little out of order, but you know.
All right. Melinda, you want to start now?
Sure. So we take and roll. I'm not sure we need to do much, but I'm Melinda Reed. I was elected in November of 2021, so I have been on since January of 2022.
Excellent. I'm Andy Shirtliff, City Commissioner. I was appointed in August of 2022. Okay, so when did you term in? Then if I wish to keep the seat, I'd have to run this year. Okay.
Wilma Collins, Mayor. I am in my second term, which is my almost 6 years.
Excellent.
Each term is 4 years.
Emily Dean, so nice to see you in person. And I was elected in 2019, and last year the 4-year term this week.
Sean Logan, same story as Commissioner Dean.
Excellent. Great.
So what we're going to do is we have 10 questions.
Yes.
And each commissioner is going to ask 2 questions.
You're okay if I refer to my notes?
Sure.
Excellent. Thank you.
So Commissioner Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Strachan, the first question deals with planning. So please tell us your experience developing, documenting, and implementing strategic plans and succession planning. Describe how you will develop an overall strategic plan for the city and how you will develop and implement succession plans for key positions such as the city manager and department heads.
Okay. Well, I think I have a fair amount. Haven't always been the key person leading them, but I've been involved in quite a few. I will tell you that if I can tell one of myself, my very first succession plan that I developed was in a city called Ucluelet, District of Ucluelet. It was we were struggling financially for a number of reasons. It was a resource-based town that was on the decline, and we're trying to find different ways of dealing with some of the issues and bring in more money and stuff. But one of the things I told the council at one time, I said, well, one of the best ways to cut some costs is when I leave, fulfill. I looked at all the staff and I said, this person over here is the one I would appoint to replace me. And so they fired me and did exactly by my plan. So that was one on myself. But in terms of strategic plans, when I started my career in 1996, I went to the North Cedar Improvement District. It was a community that had 5. I was the 5th administrator in 2 years. And they had operated in the prior fiscal year in the red an awful lot. And so one of the things I had to do there was do some fiscal stability planning, which I'd never done. So I kind of did it by just figuring it out. But I built them a 5 and 20-year financial plan, 5 years for their budget and 20 years for their capital planning. So I was quite happy with that. When I left them, they had finally had some decent reserves. Had been operating in the black the entire time I'd been there. We'd managed to build a new water tower and do some infrastructure upgrades. And so I felt pretty good about where I'd left them. In Ucluelet, I was the fourth administrator at 2 years. And their biggest issue was that they hadn't funded, they had built an $8 million water plant in a community of 1,700. And they had funded it with general fund and were flowing to, sewer, but they, instead of using enterprise funds for those or utilities, they were funding it with the general plan. And so the challenge there was to figure out how to rebalance their incomes and their fiscal stability. And then in the middle of that program, our fish plants had to shut down because the fish didn't come into the Canadian waters and they got picked up out. So we lost a lot of jobs at that point as well. So that was some water revenue planning. My first experience really with master plans was in South Jordan, Utah. I was there for 5 years. I worked almost exclusively in the municipal services group. Some of the master plans that I led while I was there included the transportation master plan, the stormwater. I was there long enough to have done it at the beginning and the end of my 5 years there. And then it started the water, culinary water master plan while I was there. And those were interesting projects because I led them as the staff responsible and led a team of people working with the consultant and our engineers and our water people to make sure that all these things were put together. And so I led that project. Later on, I went to the governor's office of management and budget in Utah. And two things that I did there that I think helped with some of the planning was I built redid their COOP plan, which is the continuity of operations plan required under FEMA. And then I was given the assignment to be a program specialist for the Free Market Protection and Privatization Board, where I worked with a consultant and we built a strategy to figure out which government services might be privatized and how to evaluate those. So that was something I did. In Provo, when I got there, the city had been operating for a number of years under a vision statement that the now former mayor had brought in when he came into office, and they had been ignoring their general plan for many, many years. And so the council tasked me with leading an interdepartmental group of people in the city to bring those into alignment. So we did that over, 6, 8, 9 months of work and got it back to a place where we could monitor and see what was happening and move forward from there. And that laid the groundwork for later on doing a full general plan, starting over, but at least having both our vision and our general plans aligned. And that was a helpful project. In terms of project management strategies, I think it's important that we develop leadership support for it. We form a steering committee to manage the process. The steering committee helps guide the different resource decisions that have to be made, who's on the team, whether to bring someone else in, how to engage the staff. It's important, I think, to do a SWOT or a SWOC analysis and see where our strengths and weaknesses are and what, where we can focus our attentions. And then out of that, come up with goals and strategies, identify best practices, and then create a reporting and feedback mechanism to work on that. And I tell you that because then the next side of this is the succession plan issue is I think it would be important here to look at our management teams and the people below our department heads and start figuring out who's got the talent, who's got the desire to move up within the organization when time comes. And I think that's an important way to do it. South Jordan's city manager, when I was there, had a really neat way of identifying the stars in the organization and then moving them around. And we used to joke that, where's your office this week? But because pretty much every year he would move the middle managers to a different department or division to give them exposure and experience on a citywide basis to help build the talent within the city. And I like that aspect, and that would be something that I would want to do, provided we had the right talent and the right resources and of course support from the commission. I think in the interest of time, that's probably what I have for your first set of questions.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Strachan. Question number 2 deals with the budget. Describe your approach to budgeting and budget outcomes. Specifically, do you prefer a centralized approach through one department or decentralized approach where each department takes a bigger role in their budgets? And what was the financial performance of organizations you previously managed?
Sure. As I understand the question, I've taken it more broadly than just creating the budget. It is managing the budget throughout the year as well. Honestly, I think I know I've experienced both forms. I know when I was in South Jordan, we went through a period where we had a lot of control of our own budgets and managing that. And then I think the year before I left, they brought in a new finance director who started centralizing everything. And suddenly all our decisions on operations were being made by somebody in the finance office and not from somebody on the ground knowing, how to deal with building roads and things like that. So that became a frustration for us. What I think has worked well in other organizations is kind of a central control, but a strong departmental participation in it. In other words, for instance, in preparing the budget, somebody's got to take the lead.
Correct.
But in terms of the actual day-to-day management of it, it needs to be a departmental responsibility, in my opinion. I don't think managers can manage well if they don't know what they've got. And I think if you have centralized control, then the tendency is to not pay attention to your budget, and you need to be paying attention to what you've got. I talked to a little bit about North Cedar and Euclid in terms of the revisions I had to make to the budgets. When I went to a place called Stewart on an interim basis, I had to help build them a 3-year budget and train a new council and all the budget process and things like that. So I had some experience with that on the ground. That was a very, very small community. Talked to you about South Jordan. In the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, I was responsible for a variety of budgets over the time I was there. I started out with 4 or 5 departmental budgets in terms of budget analysis, and that was the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Agriculture, the acronym is PLPCO, it's Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, and a couple other small agencies. And so I had to be able to analyze and understand their budgets, make recommendations to the governor for when he prepared his budget recommendations in the fall. Eventually, I was moved to the second biggest budget in the state, and that was the health department budget. And I managed that one for a couple of years, again, from a budget and policy analysis perspective, right through the legislative process until the budget was adopted. In Provo, this is probably the one I'm really the most proud of in terms of the budget cycle. Provo was Provo's a strong mayor form of government. So the mayor's side of the city would basically prepare the budget and then hand it over at the beginning of May to the council. The council would have 6 weeks to go through it, $200-300 million budget and figure out what changes they wanted. I arrived there right at the beginning of or the end of April. So I walked into the budget the very first cycle, and it was a little overwhelming because of the structure, and I was rebuilding the team and things. The challenge, I think, there was not enough time. So what I started doing was, in terms of change, and this is one of the change things that comes up later, I might re-mention it, but I started making changes incrementally to the process, and I got the administration to buy in. They had to learn to trust the changes that I was asking. But essentially, by the last 2 years I was there, we had started bringing departments in early in the year, about end of January, beginning of February, and we'd start having to do presentations about their needs and wants and the challenges that they were facing. And over time, we had to make some adjustments because sometimes council members police would come in or something and say, hey, I like this, I need this, and the moved, seconded, done. And we're like, no, you got to figure out the whole pot. But by the last 2 years I was there, when mayor went in to finish her final preparations for the budgets, she already understood by what the council's priorities were, where the council would prefer to spend money based on some of the presentations that have been spent. And very, very few, if any, changes were made to the budget in May and June because we'd done all the hard work from January through April. So that was something I was proud of, and then the incremental way of help change that. Sandy, I only had one cycle, and the biggest challenge in Sandy City was having low reserves. And so you asked about kind of what my cities were. The early cities started out kind of poorly, and I felt like by the end we had some pretty good experiences and put some balances in. In Provo actually was really good. Provo had 25% general fund reserves by the time we went into COVID. And when I left, they were still in the 25, but pushing towards 30% general fund reserves, which gives them a lot of flexibility to do a lot of other things. The biggest challenge that Provo had run into, and it may also come up again, but we had a sewer system that needed some revamping and some major changes. And that was the biggest cost impact that we had to deal. So that part wasn't so good, but the rest of the general fund and the other utilities were in pretty good shape. Sandy, very different situation. They only had 11% reserves. They had $7 million in the bank, and they had about $90 million in capital infrastructure needs that couldn't be done through utilities. So that was a big challenge, and tried to get the council to move on that one, and probably pushed a little too hard. But trying to get people to go from you don't want to spend any money or spend any tax money or raise taxes to full $80 million bite wasn't going to happen. So those are those experiences.
Thank you. This next question is about sustainability, and in terms of energy conservation, climate, etc.
Sure.
What are some of the ways in which cities like Helena can address sustainability? What would your vision for sustainability be if you were Helena's next city manager?
Sure. Of course, sustainability means different things to different people. I had a council in Provo that was ran the gamut from very conservative to very liberal. And when we talked about sustainability and things, the disagreements of what it meant were challenging. But I take it as sustainability in our context, in the city context, is, do we have a diverse enough economy to withstand some of the issues that might come? Are we addressing environmental concerns? Are we taking we doing things in a socially responsible way? And how can we address those? People talk about environmentally a lot, and we get focused on cleanliness and efficiency. And I think no matter which avenue you're going down, the biggest thing that we can do in a city of this size is bite off the things that we can chew. Look at look for what's possible and realistic that we can make efforts in. Depending on the culture here, you may want some bike paths, but you're probably not going to put in a commuter rail in a city our size, right? I'm being extreme in those, but I think what we need to do is plan for our future, make sure that any time we have an opportunity to make upgrades, they have to make sense. And then one of the things I think we need to do is walk the talk. Too often we say, okay, we have a plan and we want to have this, high level of sustainability, but then the city itself, and we saw this with our own city hall that we were building in Provo, was that we would have loved to have gone to a gold standard LEEDs. But the cost to the city was so much more. So we did what we could and tried to build it in a way that it was energy neutral and such, without having to go and spend all the extra money to do the LEED standards. So again, do what we say we're going to do, but do it in a responsible way. When it comes to some of the social responsibility and things in here, I think we have to look at the community and say, what can we do, for example, with affordable housing, rather than maybe building whole new communities. I know that forgive me, because I know there's developers come in, they want to build whole new communities. But maybe spend our time cleaning up blight where we have it and trying to make the community safer and more attractive. So that people can, stay here and want to be here. We should build sustainability into our processes. We should look at ways of getting participation from the community, from experts, from staff, from elected officials, and find a way to do things into our processes that say, okay, we are recognizing that we want to improve and do better. And I think by having a participatory culture in that, we will have more buy-in and more success. And then obviously the other one that comes up all the time is where do we invest our money? We only have so much. Maybe we could put solar on some buildings. Maybe we can invest in a little more parks. Maybe we can come up with sustainable water practices. The Salt Lake Valley right now, in fact, all of Utah is in a major drought. And so one of the things they're doing is they're changing their development standards to say we only want a certain percentage of non-used area to have grass. In other words, not used as that little decorative spot out front of the house. And I look at my house and I have more grass in the front than I do the rest of the house, just simply because that's the way it was designed. Right, I'm on a corner and all that. So, but I think there are things that we can do, and we just have to build them into our systems. And that's what from a staff perspective, I'd want to do, and what I want to represent to the commission as you make decisions.
Thank you. Next question is on housing. A lack of affordable housing is a significant issue facing Helena and Montana. What is your philosophy and approach to development and infrastructure needs?
Sure. And of course, affordable housing and housing affordability are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? I've often said about government services that we provide that we can do anything we want to if we're willing to pay for it. And the reality is we're not usually willing to pay for it. One of the challenges we had down in Utah, and still have, is we have a legislature that's trying to push different housing affordability issues onto the communities that the communities are resistant of. And it's continuing this year. But when I was in Provo, the one challenge we had was they wanted to open up the city to more accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. They wanted to there is a push from developers and builders to try and get us to drop impact fees and other costs. We pushed back, and the reason we pushed back, and I'm telling you this because that's, I think, not only does the community push back as residents sometimes on our initiatives, but so sometimes to the communities. In our case, we were pushing back, and the reason was that Provo is home to a university. The neighboring town has a university, so there's some 70,000 people living in the area, going to school in the area. 60% of all rental housing in Utah County is in Provo City, and 60% of and I'm rounding numbers, but 60% of Provo's housing is rental. And so, so they were very concerned about expanding it. They felt like we're doing what we can. But we still started looking at ways at how we can do it. And so we started looking at whether or not we could afford to provide impact fee rebates, or lowering those for specific special affordable housing projects, say through our housing authority, right? So low income, federal grant eligible type programs. Are we willing to do it there? So we started looking at things like that. We looked at whether or not we could do community land trust, and we actually we were in the process of working on that, and then we had some changeover in council, and so some of that went away. But we have had experience with working with a group called NeighborWorks, who built some small buildings, small homes, and rented those out to people. They managed those projects that we got with. I can't remember if it's just HUD money or if it was specific CDBG money, but we had all this money that we had, and were able to build homes and manage those. So there's ways of doing it, and I think we were trying to find ways to accomplish that. Now, contrast that to a place like South Jordan, where years before, the state had a requirement that when you did redevelopment areas, you had to put a certain amount of that money aside and put it into so for future affordable housing. Now, South Jordan's one of the more expensive communities in the state. And they really were trying not to ever have to spend that money. And that was kind of a problem. In fact, the city manager at the time said, well, I won't be here when they have to do it. So, but pushing it down the road. The Great Recession of 2008-9 changed that, because suddenly, instead of where we weren't allowed any apartments, suddenly there were lots of apartments getting put up in our community. And so, things change. But I would say on housing that zoning determines what products we're going to get. I would, I don't get to vote, but I would be supportive of policies that encourage housing, but not at the city's total expense. One of the things I say on that, we had discussions with one of the bigger home builders who kept saying tell the legislature, and the legislature is believing it, that the reason we don't have affordable housing is because cities charge too much for infrastructure. And yet the reality is that there's this philosophical discussion you have to have with was, do you make the people moving in pay for the new infrastructure, or do you share it across the city? Again, kind of a philosophical approach. But overall, yeah, I'll keep my answers to that. I just think that there are things that we can do, and what is it we're going to do?
Thank you. All right, we're talking about business partnership.
Yes.
What has been your experience working with business groups and organizations like our downtown Helena initiatives and business improvement districts? Do you have prior experience working with tax increment financing in urban renewal districts?
Yes. So, Mayor, let me preface to say this. Most of my experience in these areas specifically were from the legislative side, working for the city council. So, getting these passed, getting them evaluated, whether or not to go forward with them. The actual day-to-day administration was handled by our economic development folks. But I will tell you that in Provo, we had a great working relationship with what's called Downtown Provo Inc. We funded, I think when I started there, we funded about 25% of their budget. As a way to develop, and we had members of the council and administration on their board. So we went with them fairly regularly during the time I was there to understand how things were going and where we could put efforts. When we did our city bond, general obligation bond for our new city hall, we actually worked with Downtown Provo's executive director to help with that campaign as well. So there's partnership there. TIFs were an interesting one because I had a fairly significant portion, but not a majority of my council who didn't want to ever vote for TIFs because they felt like it was a zero-sum game, that maybe we ought not to have them as a tool, but we still did them, and they had to make really good financial sense for the community. We had gotten to a point when I got there before I got there, but we finally got to a point where we felt like on most projects we didn't need to do much. So if a TIF wasn't going to create something that would really provide a significant new opportunity, like we brought in a private medical school. They were building a school and campus, and so we used TIFs and public infrastructure PIDs, public infrastructure development agreements, to help them build their facility. So we did something like that. Let me think. In terms of another business partnership I'd like to talk about. So I mentioned earlier, UCLOL way back when we had some serious financial repercussions on the forestry that went dead before I got there, and then a fishery plants that had to shut. We had to cut back on staff and budgets and things like that. one of the things I did in that period was I worked with our mayor and we organized a roundtable where we brought in people from our regional district, which is like a county. We brought people in from our state government or provincial government. We brought in people from like the Chamber of Commerce. We brought people in from some of the business community. And we did a roundtable in our community to try and find ways that we could bring more money into our community to develop more business, to transition better and more quickly toward being a tourist-based economy, because the city on the other end of the peninsula, about 42 kilometers away, that's what they did. They were ecotourism, they were booming. We had always been a resource-based town, forestry and fisheries, and so we were trying to find a way to transition to get some of that extra. Get a national park right between the two cities, so why wouldn't we try to do that? So we actually brought that in, and I was actually very happy with the first year. We managed to get some grants for some experimental forestry products. We also got some grants to help with what we called the Wild Pacific Trail, which was a trail on the big black rocks up above the ocean. People could walk through, just walk through rainforest, and it was just beautiful. So I felt like that was the last year I was there, but I felt like we had some success in bringing the community together, bringing in outside and internal interests, and creating a product. And in doing that, I organized just the background work, I'll say, on creating the Euclid Economic Development Corporation, which we use to manage those grants and develop those things. So that was a partnership effort that I was really part of.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Geez, my final question here is commission relations. Describe your experience and approach to building trust and credibility with the commission, board, or similar entity. Please describe, and this is it's a three-part question.
Sure.
So if you want to go to the first part.
Nope, give it all to me, because I've got my notes and I'll work through it.
I hear you. There we go. Please describe how you maintain relationships and continuity with commission or board members when there is a turnover due to term limits or elections. And finally, please describe your approach to building consensus within a divided board or council.
Sure. Okay, let me start with a little story. My first experience with a board or council or commission was in the North Cedar Improvement District. When I was there, we had 7 by-elections in 3 years. It's because people would up and quit, and there was a lot of contention. But I had a fellow on the commission or the board of trustees who was, in my view, was very difficult. And there were times where he was causing fights with people, and he'd come into my office and scream at me and things. And I sat down with him and really just started listening to what his concerns was. And the challenge we had in that little community was small community, about 3,500 $1 million homes right on the ocean, and then trailer parks in the middle. And so the very divergent social economic needs, and the board of trustees would kind of sway back and forth depending on who showed up for the voting. And but his real issue was the board had cliques, and they weren't sharing information, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I learned from that experience was to immediately start making sure everything gets shared, to find ways to help them connect. And so from a difficult circumstance, it created some really good learning for me. Subsequently, in my career, what I have found that works with councils, especially during transition, is to do some form of orientation or onboarding with them, to train them as to kind of the culture of the board, or the commission or the council to identify expectations, teach them about the rules, help them understand, what it is we do, help them understand the lanes we're in, those kinds of things. When I was with Provo, I came in right after a change of council. I had, counting that one and the 3 elections after, I had 4 different sets of council members, not all the time, but everybody was typically about every 2 years I'd lose 2 or 3 members of the council. One of the things that was really neat about the councils I had there was a philosophy that we built, and it was basically that don't make the decisions you make personal, because I may need you on the very next item. So don't get all hot and bothered over, your opposition to this item or support for that item. And they were very good about recognizing that in their relationships. And I could see them get hot about one issue, and then the very next issue is like nothing had happened. But it was partly because they had learned respect for each other and for the process. And so we worked really hard to keep that, to remind them that this is what makes the council work so well. One of the other things that we did was just little nuanced things. The mayor, of course, our system sat on the end of the table. The council members, we had a chair, but other than the chair, everybody else we moved around. So instead of forming cliques, like maybe you two always sit together and don't really get to know these two because you're not communicating with them all the time. So we'd move them around all the time so they'd have that different interaction in meetings. And then when we looked at our committee structure, we tried to have committees that had people representing kind of both ends of the spectrum of politics and different viewpoints. We might have an issue where somebody we're dealing with transportation, so we might have someone who's a bike rider. Provo was big on bikes, but we might also have someone on there that wouldn't never ever want to have a bike or doesn't care about it. But we'd trying to mix people so that they had different viewpoints and they could listen and work together, and that helped. From my perspective, I did 2 things. I communicated a lot individually with the council members, and both formally and informally. In the early years, until I felt really comfortable, I would do my own form of a performance review. I would sit down with the council members and have them evaluate, how they thought it was going. And that was helpful to me, just to make sure I was on the right track and go those routes. We also had, we would do trainings together and we would do retreats together. So, we might go to the League of Cities and Towns and send different groups to different things, but we'd have them sit together and work together and send staff with them. Just lots of ways to build connection, because I think the connection and the respect that you have for each other comes from being together and ultimately liking each other. We found that we could get past the kind of the political divide, even though it was nonpartisan. You could tell, you knew who was Republican, who was Democrat. We just know. So those are some of the things I did. One last thing that when I was with the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, I was responsible for 2 different boards. One was the Legislative Compensation Commission, and one was the Privatization Board. And the state had provided some very specific guidelines about membership. You had to have some rural membership. You had to have people representing both parties. You had to have government appointees. Anyway, my big thing with those bodies was to spend time with them in terms of training about the mission and what we were supposed to do and work well with them. So communication, I think, has always been the best part of building that trust and credibility with the boards that I've worked with. I hope I'm doing okay on time.
Great.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. So question number 7.
Yes.
Please describe your change management process and the outcome of significant organizational changes you implemented. Include an example of how you were able to overcome resistance to change.
Okay. Oh. I told you about the Provo experience with budgets, so you got that sense of what we did there. Trying to think of a good one there. We had a neighborhood program in Provo as well. And I won't say that we were always successful in overcoming the change, because sometimes we were pushing to make changes in a way that would work. We had a neighborhood program with 34 neighborhoods. Each neighborhood had an elected, someone who was basically a neighborhood meeting would elect a chair. Some of our chairs, quite honestly, started feeling like they had vetoes over development or other things. And we had a number of them who's just personality wise would get in the way of good relationships. So we started making changes to the neighborhood program. We created a committee to look at it, had tremendous resistance, especially from some of our more difficult personalities. One personality, a council member, finally took aside. We talked about how to deal with this individual, finally took the individual aside and basically said, you need to resign because you're killing the program. If you continue the way you are, the council and the mayor will just end it, because it's causing too many problems. Nobody wants to work with you, those kinds of things. So we dealt with the personality issue. But generally what we found was, if we took the time to explain the problems we were having, to try and consult with them on the committee members and such on why we were starting to have stumbling blocks. For instance, we had some people that would just burden staff with many questions, far too much interference, to the point where they didn't want to work with the public anymore. That's a problem. So we started having to explain this to the neighborhood program people and try and make some changes. So we made some changes. We made some changes in training. We made some changes in responsibility. I won't say we were 100% successful, but by the time the process was done, we were able to make some changes, I think, that will help them in the future. Will they be perfect? No. But the key really is to listen and learn. We had to outline and help them engage in this understanding of the need for change. We built support, and then we started, monitoring progress as certain changes were made, and that's how we did it. Same kind of thing we did with the budget process. As we every year after the budget process, we made changes. Those years incremental changes. We say, well, did that work? Did that not work? And then what can we do better? And so that was helpful. In retrospect, with the neighborhood program, I would have liked to have started it earlier. And I would have liked to have done it more incrementally than trying to push it after we had a point. We were at a breaking point. So I would have liked to make those changes earlier.
Right, thank you. Next question. Question number 8. City of Helena wants to modernize, improve business processes, and to proactively address changing community needs. This includes updating legacy systems such as the financial enterprise resource planning software and improving business processes for the project planning and management, communication, data transfer, and management. Please describe your experience implementing new systems and business processes. Please be specific as to the systems or processes you implemented and the outcome of those efforts.
Sure. I'll give you 2. The first, I was a user and not the implementer. Provo City back in 2015 initiated a project that got underway in 2016. It was called Provo 360. The IT department, the administration wanted to take some 150, 180 programs that were throughout the city, many of which didn't talk to each other, and condense them down to about 30. So we brought in a company to coordinate that, to build this new software. We had off the top of my head, we had $3 million or $5 million budget, but it was supposed to last 3 years. When I left at the end of 26 or 2022, it wasn't finished yet. And part of that was we had some issues with I think the city had bid off too much. The contractor didn't deliver on some of their commitments. So they actually at one point in there fired the contractor and brought someone else in. The reason I tell you this negative experience on that was at the end of we saw some really great changes over time, but it wasn't easy. It took longer. It was more costly. There were lots of bumps and start, and from a staff perspective, and I'm sure from the public perspective, it was frustrating because things that our department might be promised we're going to get this upgrade now, and 9 months later we're still waiting. Those were challenges. Now I think at the end of the day, at the end of the process, they had made some really good changes. It just took a lot longer and more expensive. On a much smaller note, apologize to two of you who were at the earlier discussion with the Helena citizens group, but in the city council office, I wanted to make some changes. We wanted to improve our engagement. So one of the things we went out and did was we went out and asked, we sought some public engagement software. We were using social media, et cetera. But we brought in a program called Open Town Hall, which we called Open City Hall for our purposes. And we implemented that from scratch. And we did it as a team. I actually assigned one of my staffers to lead the committee that was working on it. But what we went out and did was we brought this program in, we installed it, we tested it, we practiced on it, we created policies around it, because the council first was a little bit reticent. Some of them were like, yeah, go for it. And others were, wait a minute, I want to know what's going on. And so we created policies about what we could and could not put on in terms of questions. And over time, it became a really great tool for us, because we would go out and reach out to the public for engagement. And we say, here's this topic. For instance, in Provo one year, we decided the Economic Development Department came and said, we want permission to allow brew pubs in a very dry city, right? Wanted to have brew pubs in the downtown. And so we went out to the public and asked what they thought. We had 5,000 or 7,000 responses and ran the gamut. But we did that. We put that in so that we could have those discussions, so that we reach the people that we weren't normally reaching. Because you probably see the same 10 to 13 people every commission meeting. We wanted to reach out beyond those. And so we did it. Good. They're great. We wanted to have them there, but we wanted to get more. So we used that program. But we created policy. We tested products. We set expectations. We communicated how to use it. We communicated what to expect with it. We learned things along the way and made revisions based on it. One of the things we discovered, for example, was that if you could register to use, we knew that, or you could go not register. And what we found was that when we started looking at numbers and what the votes were, like it's not a scientific method, but what we found was that there would be a discrepancy between the registered voters or the registered participants and the non-registered, because the non-registered could just crowdsource it, and so that became something we had to fix. But we adjusted as needed. We were quite proud of the work we did. That led us into, of course, COVID. And of course, you all probably had to change here too, right? We shut down our meetings. We went to first to a completely online. In our offices, we were the first to really play with Zoom. And so we went into the Zoom meetings. My communications person in my office was very connected in terms of her field. And so she immediately brought in all these fixes to problems other people were having, like the Salt Lake City's council meeting got horn bombed or something on theirs, Zoom bombed, I think they call it. but we took steps early on, and then what we actually did a really good job with it, because we started training everybody else in our area, not only in our city, but other cities would contact us and say, hey, you guys are doing this well, how do you do it? Subsequently, as part of that implementation of the experience, we built into our new city hall, we kept hybrid meetings. And so Zoom meetings are a complete part of our the process that we set up. And that was a change that we initiated by necessity, but we learned enough from it that we found it was a very good way to do so. That's an example of implementing some technology.
Question number 9. How would you describe your leadership style? And could you please tell us why it's important to understand your leadership style and how you determine the most effective leadership style for a particular job, organization, and situation?
Sure. I advocate for the speed of trust. If you're familiar with
Say
that.
that again,
It's
please.
The Speed of Trust by Stephen M.R. Covey. What I like about the speed of trust is when you extend trust and build trust and hold people accountable and develop capacity and capabilities and competencies. When you do that, things get done faster and cheaper. When you don't have trust, they don't. So I advocate for that. When it comes to developing personnel within that leadership style, I like to give people opportunities to grow. I'm a delegator, but I'm also a doer. I do not like to micromanage, but I do like to know what's going on. I don't like surprises, and nor has any elected official I've ever worked for. So. With respect to particular jobs or situations and such, I like to look at the personnel we're dealing with. Some people are ready for a new challenge, some aren't. And so the issue of whether it's a delegate or get somebody to grow outside their comfort zone. If I can, I like to, but people aren't always ready. So you have to look at that. I like to help people reach their potential. I'm very much of the mind that that if I can help them grow, the happier they'll be. And so I support professional development. I support people who want to try on new projects, who want to take on new challenges. I think that's part of the kind of the succession planning thing too, right? Is where's your talent and how do you help them grow? Now, I've watched a lot of people move on to other places and other jobs, but it's always been promotion, and that's what I pride myself if I see somebody grow and they're nowhere for here, and they go somewhere else and they feel successful, then I'm happy for them. I think the challenge you have, because I think it comes up in one of your questions or the leadership's questions, but this issue of succession planning is in terms of how do we keep them. That's going to be always an issue. But in terms of my style, I like to participatory. I don't have all the answers. I'm a generalist. I'm going to rely on advice from the people I work with. My attitude is more can do rather than why we can't. I'm willing to explore things and see, how we can get something done until it's very, very clear that we just can't. So those kinds of things. But I would say that I'm not a micromanager. I delegate, I trust, I expect results. And in terms of how I want to be led, I like to have clear directions. I like a recognition of where my responsibilities start and end, and I try to do the same for the people that report to me.
Thank you. The final question. Do you have any questions for the commission or anything you would like to add before we fix this all?
So many, so many, most of which I won't ask. Really, it comes down to two things. One feeds off that last one, and that is how do you manage the city manager? And then the other side, the other question I have really is, how do you see success in this role? How do you view the day-to-day interactions with the city manager?
Well, I mean, any one of us could answer.
Sure.
For me, I see success when projects are completed. I see success when the commission can come together and say, these are the projects we were able to successfully complete. That's a successful city manager, in my opinion.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know about the others. but- Go ahead, Commissioner.
Build off his, if that, I was gonna go back to the management part, so if you're.
Yeah, I would just say, touching on what the mayor started with, because we are part-time.
Yeah.
And because it is a forum, if more than two of us are together at the same time, I think, the managing of the city manager and like the mayor made about, you'll get 5 different answers from us, that rings quite true.
Yeah.
We are not all together all the time, and able to articulate cohesively on many issues, what our shared vision is.
Sure.
But I think what the mayor said about completion of projects, and we can tell when the residents of the city are happy.
Yeah.
Those are good indicators of success, but I think we would all give you a unique perspective on what that might look like.
One thing that I just add, going into this city manager recruitment process, we basically did kind of an after action report of some of our past recruitment processes and where we needed to improve. I guess. I think I would say probably like more systemically, and then also just structurally. And so one thing that we've all committed to and is included in the report is being much more having systems in place to ensure that we're providing consistent and uniform city manager reviews. And that the commission is on board and in agreement about how those are conducted, and it doesn't come on the back end, but you know what's expected at the front end, so that a year from now we can say, as the mayor alluded to, these were the top priorities that we had all agreed upon. Did we successfully complete those or not?
Right.
And I would just say that this is communication, which is sometimes difficult when there's 5 plus a number of directors reporting directly to you and staff and our community. I think because it's seat of state government, they know they're right, and they are very knowledgeable. All of our citizens are, and they will let you know, which is great, but it also is one of those things where managing expectations is really important.
Yeah, that's helpful. I've had the experience at times where it feels like I have 7 bosses. And I've had times where it feels like I've had 1 boss, right, with councils. And it's much easier from the staff perspective when we feel like you have the one boss, one clarity as to what the directions are, and so much so that very first experience, one of the fixes that we put in there was that unless it was a motion of the board, it didn't have to be done because we had too many people trying to control a few staff.
Yeah.
So that was a challenge, but.
I'd say an element of success is, just that the manager has a strong understanding of the charter and the roles and responsibilities that the manager has and that the commission has. And sometimes it's okay for the manager really to push back. I mean, I don't think as a city manager that it's your obligation that we say, you say how.
Right.
That sometimes they may come to you with a completely crackpot answer. And I would hope, or question, and I would hope you would say, you might want to think about this.
Right.
Or, if there's something that I'm doing that, is not congruent with the charter that, I don't mind being reminded of that.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting relationship. In my experience, it's on one hand, you are performing and sometimes you are protecting. And in my experience, you just have the ability to have respectful disagreement and the ability to work out maybe better solutions with some dialogue is very helpful. And sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. The better councils I've worked with have had it. So,
All right. Well, sir,
Thank you. Thank you.
thanks for being here and indulging us.
I appreciate the invitation and I've enjoyed the process.
Great. Thank you.
Sorry, the temperature's dropping so much.
With that.
I said, sorry, the temperature's dropping so much.
Oh,
Bro, you brought it from
You brought it from you.
Okay.
did I? I thought it was from my family in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Strachan.
Thank you. Getting through time.
Thanks, Cliff.
He's nice.
This afternoon.
Back in this room.